Number of people here, so I think we can actually go ahead and jump right in. Welcome everyone to the Research Ethics and Policy series. My name is Holly Fernandez Lynch. I'm an assistant professor of medical ethics, and I am co-chairing this series alongside Steve Joffe. And today we're really excited to welcome Dr. Jason Karlawish, who's going to be discussing FDA's approval of aducanumab for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease and some of the research ethics and policy issues that have arisen in that context. I'm going to introduce Dr. Karlawish in just a moment, but I'll just run through a couple of brief announcements. We are recording this session. Mary Pham will go ahead and post that to the Medical Ethics and Health Policy website as soon as it's ready. And you can also find previous session recordings there. And on this slide, you can see our lineup for the rest of the academic year. We also have more information about these speakers and their planned topics on the MAHP events calendar. So next, we're going to hear in November from Dr. Scott Halpern, who will be talking about his recent trial studying the impact of payment on research participation. And then in December, we'll host Dr. Kim Smith-Whitley, who will be talking to us about ethics and policy in sickle cell research. So please don't forget to let us know if you have suggestions for people that we should consider inviting, especially individuals from diverse backgrounds or who would contribute diverse perspectives to issues relevant to research ethics and policy. And so you can send a note to me, Mary, Steve Joffe, if you have ideas for people or topics that you'd like to see covered here. A quick note about a couple of, let me proceed here. About some online resources that our department has available. This is a series of short research ethics courses that are available for free continuing education credit. And you can use some of these to satisfy your research ethics training requirements at Penn and CHOP. And if you go to the website at the bottom of the screen there, you can find out more information about that. A brief word of thanks to all of the co-sponsors that you see here for making REPS possible, and to Mary Pham for coordinating everything for us each month. And now I'm happy to introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Jason Karlawish. Dr. Karlawish is a professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. And he's also a practicing geriatrician. He is director of Penn's Neurodegenerative Disease Ethics and Policy Program, associate director of the Clinical Core and co-associate director of the Alzheimer's Disease Core Center, and co-director of the Penn Memory Center. His research focuses on neuroethics and policy, and he's investigated issues in dementia, drug development, informed consent, quality of life, research and treatment decision-making, and voting by persons with dementia. And of course, you can find out lots more about Dr. Karlawish, as well as his recent writings on aducanumab by Googling him. But I don't want to spend any more time on intros. I want to turn things over to you, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me stop sharing these slides here. And for everybody who's joining us today, we will take questions. We'll make sure we reserve about 15 minutes or so towards the end of today's remarks. Okay, take it away.
Thanks. So greetings, everyone. I'm joining you from my office on Penn's campus. I don't want to look at myself, so how do I get rid of myself? Well, all right, now I'm much smaller. I don't really see myself. I don't have slides. I'm talking, so sorry. You're just going to have to listen to me. You don't have to look at me. If you want to make it like radio, just mute the video. But if you want to enjoy the visual of me, here I am in my office at Penn. I must say, but given the audience, given the crowd and your interests, I want to just give a plug on for November 9th of this semester, 7 p.m. at the Kelly Writers House, November 9th, 7 p.m. You're all invited to attend. John Keats, scientist and poet. My colleague Tony Bowers in the Department of English and I are going to be co-hosting a event to learn about Keats's creativity across the boundaries of science and poetry. I realize Keats seems like an old romantic poet of little relevance to now, but I would like you all to recognize that his poems speak all the more now to issues we face in the practice of medicine. He truly is one of the finest of the medical humanities writers, I think. So join us November 9th, 7 p.m., Kelly Writers House, John Keats, scientist and poet. But that's not why you came. You came for the strange tale of aducanumab. So what I have is a set of remarks I've prepared. There's a couple of natural breakpoints if people have questions maybe, but certainly at the end I hope to have some time to talk. I will confess that these remarks represent my effort to begin to compose my thoughts on the aducanumab story, in part because I'd like to put a sort of afterward chapter in the paperback version of my book, The Problem of Alzheimer's, which talks about the aducanumab story, but obviously came out after the before the FDA's decision on aducanumab. Of course, the story's not done yet. We'll talk a bit about that. If I had to think about a title for this talk, it might be another title. It might be the 22% solution with a question mark, because in late May of this year, the Alzheimer's Association launched a media campaign called More Time. Maria Carrillo, who's the chief science officer for the association, explained the purpose of More Time. She spoke about how persons who are living with mild cognitive impairment caused by Alzheimer's disease and their families face a dire future. And in an interview, she said, think about having months longer in that stage of mild cognitive impairment before you go into the dementia diagnosis. That's a pretty big deal. The longer you stay in this independent mild cognitive impairment stage, the longer you stay in mild dementia before you move into moderate dementia, which we know is much more debilitating, much more of a loss of independence, much more dependent on caregiving and longer hours of caregiving. So that's why we think that even a 22% reduction is still worth that time for individuals that are in that stage. Even a 22% reduction she was referring to was the effect of a drug on the lives of persons living with Alzheimer's disease, mild stage dementia or mild cognitive impairment. And the drug she was referring to was a drug called aducanumab, which is owned, studied, and the association hoped soon to be sold by the pharmaceutical company Biogen. The drug requires monthly infusions, and the studies that Biogen presented to the FDA showed that it reduced levels of amyloid in the brains of persons living with Alzheimer's disease, and the company argued its data showed slowed disease progression. And the association's campaign was messaging to people that compared to persons whose monthly infusion was a placebo, those who got aducanumab received 22% more time. So soon, no later than June 7th, FDA was to issue its decision on the drug for this media campaign that is launched in late May. The social media campaign would generate over 1 million responses. The association would gather some of those responses to a letter to the FDA detailing the groundswell of support for the approval of aducanumab. People facing Alzheimer's are facing a progressive and fatal disease and would give anything to have more time, the association wrote. To deny millions of people days, weeks, months, or even years of active life, particularly with early diagnosis, is inhumane. On the morning of June 7th, by 11 a.m., the FDA issued its announcement, and they agreed with the association. They had approved aducanumab for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, the first approval of a drug that targets one of the pathologies of Alzheimer's, namely elevated amyloid. This decision was the bookend of a 5-year story that began in September of 2016, when aducanumab made the cover of Nature, the prestigious journal of science, Nature. The title of that cover story was Targeting Amyloid. And what that study was a phase 1 study of aducanumab versus placebo in a randomized controlled trial in persons with diagnosed dementia or mild cognitive impairment caused by Alzheimer's. And the cover photo of Nature said it all. The cover photo depicted 2 amyloid scan results. One showed a cool blue brain, which means no evidence of amyloid. And the other showed a brain that was quite red, which is the representation of elevated amyloid by a PET scanner. And the message was, of course, that aducanumab cleared the amyloid from the brain. And that was game-changing, some said, but it was a phase 1 study. It was not designed to assess whether the drug made a difference in clinical course. Of course, they measured cognition and other clinical measures, not intended to be the point of the study, but showed some suggestive changes on those clinical measures that suggested certainly with the removal of amyloid and the signal on those clinical measures, further study was necessary. In fact, in an accompanying editorial by Eric Ryman, who's an internationally prominent Alzheimer's researcher at the Banner Alzheimer's Institute, he wrote, if that hint of clinical benefit is confirmed, it would be a game changer in the fight against Alzheimer's disease, a game changer. Well, between that cover story, which made the news in 2016, and June 7th of this year, is not a story, though, of progressive and inevitable triumph of the scientific method. That's a simple story. But instead, this is really three stories tied together in a kind of Gordian knot. A tragedy of the scientific method, I will argue, a failure of the regulatory scientific methods, and a masterful play of business interests. Together, these three stories tell the strange history of how aducanumab transformed into Aduhelm for the treatment of Alzheimer's, sold by Biogen. Before I dive into that story, I want to tell you a bit about where I stand, who I am. I am, as Holly said, I'm a scholar in ethics and policy, focused on issues raised by cognitive disorders that occur in older adults, and Alzheimer's has been a very useful model for that research. I'm also a writer, and I write a lot on topics related to aging, ethics, with an emphasis again on Alzheimer's and other diseases that cause disabling cognitive impairments. I'm a low-grade researcher in the clinical development of biomarkers and treatments at the Penn Memory Center, serving as a site PI or co-PI on some studies. I'm a clinician. I care for patients at the Penn Memory Center, particularly persons with Alzheimer's disease and other diseases that cause disabling cognitive impairments, and of course, caring for their families. And finally, I'm a caregiver. My father has Alzheimer's disease with mild stage dementia. He lives alone up in New Jersey, and from a distance, I organize his care. All right, let's go back to June 7th. That FDA approval was not standard approval. It wasn't the approval that I think most of us think about. The drug has been judged to be safe and effective, and now the company can market it within the confines of the label. But the approval was what's known as accelerated approval, meaning the FDA used a set of regulations dating back to the 1990s that allow a drug to be put into clinical practice, sold by the manufacturer, on the basis not of showing that the drug affects a clinical outcome, reduces death, slows disability, but on a marker that stands for the disease, a biomarker is the term, and it is believed that it is reasonably likely that the change on the biomarker translates into clinical benefit. So in this case, it was the biomarker of amyloid is clearly lowered by aducanumab. That was known in 2016. That was proven by the phase 1 study. But there was a reasonable likelihood that that lowering of amyloid would translate into clinical benefit. That's what FDA said. But a further study would be needed, done by Biogen, as they were selling the drug, to confirm whether, in fact, lowering amyloid, it does translate into clinical benefit for persons living with either mild cognitive impairment or dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease. When that decision was issued, myself and most everyone else in the field, whether you agreed or disagreed with FDA's decision, was shocked, because that was never the conversation that we were having up until June 7th. Nowhere in the discussion, at no point of the Biogen application to FDA, was the accelerated approval mechanism part of the conversation, which takes me back to November of 2020. When the advisory committee that FDA convened, because FDA chooses to convene advisory committees if it wants one, and they did, convened an advisory committee to review the evidence that Biogen had presented to approve aducanumab for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Now, usually when FDA convenes an advisory committee meeting, it's because there's some sort of difference, there's some sort of controversy, there's some sort of question that they want answered. In this case, this was an unusual meeting, and this is not just my impression, it was the impression of members of the advisory committee as well, because FDA essentially went in saying, we think that this drug should be approved as a safe and effective treatment. A standard approval question was put before, and we want to present you our argument, and we'd like you to vote on it. And the argument they made was an argument in conjunction with Biogen. In other words, FDA presented the case to favor approval, and Biogen presented a case to favor approval. So they both were arguing for the same conclusion using very similar data, if not the same data. And they wanted the advisory board to say, essentially, do you agree with our point? It was a little funny, though, because what they were presenting were data that were from not one, but two studies, which is not uncommon to conduct two simultaneously designed phase 3 studies so as to provide confirmatory evidence. But the problem was that one study showed that the drug had an effect on the primary endpoint greater than placebo, that was greater than chance. The other study didn't show that. The other study was unable to reject that null hypothesis. And so you had one study that was, quote, positive, and one study that was, quote, negative. And we'll drill down into those two studies a bit more later. Moreover, at one point, one of the advisory committee members asked the FDA, what about the use of amyloid as a surrogate to stand for the benefit? And FDA explicitly, Billy Dunn, who was the lead presenter for FDA, rejected that was not something that was on the table. Later, we would learn, in fact, that that was not the case, that FDA had been in conversations with Biogen about the use of amyloid lowering as a surrogate way to express benefit and for approval. That conversation had been going on prior to November. That would not come out, though, until after June 7th, when more and more information spilled out about the approval. In addition, an FDA statistician had prepared a report independent from Billy Dunn's group, reviewing the Biogen's application. And in that report, the statistician concluded that the evidence was not sufficient to grant the drug approval as a safe and effective treatment, and actually would point to the data about relating amyloid lowering to clinical outcome and show very poor relationships between the amount of amyloid reduction by the drug and change on clinical measures. That report was available as a pre-recorded Zoom-based slideshow with audio narration by the statistician. It was not at all part of the presentation. The Tristan, I'm sorry, I forget his last name, never presented this, and it was never discussed at the hearing. It was just available for those who wanted to talk about it, and it had to be slipped in between the questions. So it was a very unusual meeting for a number of reasons. The committee would vote, and they would vote all but one against all of the questions that FDA had asked, meaning none of their votes favored approval. One vote was uncertain on one of the questions. So what one would describe as a near unanimous rejection of the application. So at that point in November, with that committee hearing outcome, most felt that regardless of their view on the drug, that FDA would probably not approve the drug because most times FDA follows the recommendations of its advisory committees. And in the few times, about 1 in 5, when it has overturned an advisory committee's recommendation and done the opposite of what the committee recommended, it's usually to take a stance that is a, quote, more conservative. That is to not approve a drug, but rather to say further study is needed. And indeed, most agreed more study was needed, with one positive and one negative study, and the need for all these sub-analyses, et cetera, that were done to make the case that while the data were provocative, and indeed it is quite possible this drug actually does work, the study's designs and analyses simply didn't add up to making the case that it should be available with a prescription. So let me set some larger stage here at this point. So far, I've been very granular and focused on aducanumab, but I think it's important to situate this drug into a larger conversation about events that have been unfolding over the last 10 years in America. Most of you probably don't know this, but the United States actually has a national Alzheimer's plan. This is a real plan. This is not just a document that sits on a shelf somewhere filed away in the Federal Register with perhaps an accompanying postage stamp, et cetera, to make everyone feel good. This is a real dynamic living document that guides federal efforts to take on the problem of Alzheimer's. It was signed into law on January 4th, 2011 by President Obama as he was just about ready to head off to the resort he'd like to go to in Hawaii. So he signed it in Hawaii. There are no photographs available of President Obama signing this legislation. Think about that. There's no photo of him with Harry Johns, president of the Alzheimer's Association, George Friedenberg, president of Us Against Alzheimer's, two of the leading patient advocacy organizations, or others. There's no photographs of him with patients or a family member signing the National Alzheimer's Project Act into law. There's no record that I could find. That was very deliberate because the association who led this effort wanted to keep this under the political radar. They did not want the massive increases in funding that they were going to ask for to become part of a larger conversation in Washington about what does Obama want to do now, given the toxicity in Washington over spending money, especially if President Obama wanted you to spend it. The plan calls for a regularly updated plan to address the problem of Alzheimer's in America, setting clear goals, strategies, and tactics, documenting whether they've been achieved, revisiting the plan every year in a national meeting convened in Bethesda. The other part of the National Alzheimer's Plan is what's known as a bypass budget. It's a funky term coming out of Washington, which essentially says that what NIH wants to pay for funding for Alzheimer's research, essentially NIH will get courtesy of the executive branch putting it in the budget. It essentially steps aside from the usual congressional review and appropriation to NIH and instead makes a direct appropriation to NIA's requests for funds dedicated to Alzheimer's disease research. There are two other diseases in America that have bypass budgets. Since the early 1970s, cancer, and since the late 1980s, early 1990s, HIV/AIDS. So Alzheimer's has enjoyed this kind of budgetary mechanism, and it has resulted in a massive increase in federal funding through NIH for research in Alzheimer's disease. Goal number one of the National Alzheimer's Plan is to prevent or effectively treat Alzheimer's disease by 2025. By 2025, the United States will discover a pharmacologic intervention that effectively treats or prevents Alzheimer's disease by 2025. That's been a goal since about 2015. Don't quote me exactly when that goal was first issued. And every year, it's been renewed with updates on the progress. There's an irony, by the way, about the National Alzheimer's Plan and that goal. Obama's last State of the Union address in January 2016, he did embrace an investment in a moonshot cure. So he told the people of the United States of America, for the loved ones we've all lost, the families that we can still save, let's make America the country that cures cancer. So he set us on a moonshot for cancer. He never set us on a moonshot for Alzheimer's. I don't think the average American knows about the 2025 deadline, but people in the field knew about the 2025 deadline. And I'll come back to that quietest of moonshots in my analysis remarks at the end. All right, what happened between 2016 and 2021? I told you about the two identical phase 3 randomized controlled trials. They enrolled persons with mild cognitive impairment, those individuals Maria Correa was referring to, who were still independent, and if they can get 22% more time, that's surely worth it, or mild stage dementia, and they had to have documented elevated amyloid by a PET scan that measures amyloid. There was no requirement for the other pathologic marker of Alzheimer's, namely tau protein. In the field, there's a comment we like to make, where were you on March 21st? It sort of resembles where were you on September 11th or November 22nd. Well, most of us know September 11th. Many, I think, don't know November 22nd anymore. It was the day President Kennedy was shot. In my book, by the way, there's an error. I said the 23rd. Anyway, what happened on March 21st was Biogen released the results of futility analyses of those two phase 3 studies. These futility analyses essentially were analyses designed to say, what's the probability of having a positive result? And if this analysis suggested that probability was less than 1 in 5. It was so low that Biogen made a business decision to stop the drug studies. And they announced that they were ceasing further development of aducanumab. The drug was done because of the futility analyses. Now, futility analyses are done, some say, for patient safety and well-being. That's actually not true. They're done for business decisions. Because all the futility analysis is saying is, it's unlikely that this drug is not going to work. It doesn't say that the drug is harming people. People have given consent recognizing the drug may harm them. And the decision is really one of, it's not worth continuing to study this drug, and spend all the money and time necessary to continue studying it. The problem with the phase 3 studies, in addition to futility analysis that was built into them, was they were slipshod, rushed studies. Biogen, in an effort to get things done quickly, and the theme of speed here, of time, 22%, 2025, is a theme that runs through this story. Biogen skipped phase 2. They were allowed to skip that phase of testing between phase 1 and phase 3 when you can figure out dosing. And this would haunt the phase 3 studies, because as they did the studies and got more data in from a small phase 2 study they got going simultaneous to the phase 3 study, they discovered that their dosing regimen needed to be adjusted. And so they would amend the protocol to adjust the dosing of the drug, the kind of thing that introduces noise and adds more variance into a database. Anyway, all those things said, futility analysis is done. Studies are shut down. Meanwhile, though, after study shutdown, more data is coming in from the sites because they're cleaning up their data, shipping it in to wrap up the study. And those data are now analyzed, the additional data that came in after the shutdown. And Phoenix-like aducanumab rises from the ashes, because that's when they discovered, with an added data added to the data set, that one of the studies, in fact, was positive, but the other was negative. And I've already told you what happened by the time it got to FDA's advisory board hearing, and obviously the events since then. Well, I said Phoenix-like, but actually maybe the better expression is Onyx-like. Onyx is a crystal, I'll explain in a minute, because Project Onyx was the name of a project at Biogen that described Biogen's efforts to move the drug forward to approval. Onyx is an interesting name because it's a mineral of silica made of layered bands of crystals. They have parallel bands, typically of black and white. And the reason why onyx was a very interesting choice, more so than Phoenix, was because the onyx is symbolically used as a crystal to represent the ability of opposing or different kinds to coexist, a balance of the good and the bad, if you will, into a karma that you can live with. It was actually, Biogen was originally going to call it Project Phoenix, but in-house counsel at Biogen said, don't call it Project Phoenix, and so they changed the name. And it was a project which laid out how Biogen would work closely with FDA to move this drug into an approval. And this is what would come out actually after the June 7th, which was that the very close relationship developed between Biogen and FDA. In particular, Billy Dunn, who had led the FDA's case at the November hearing, has emerged as a champion for this approval. In Stat News reported that about Billy Dunn that prior to the Biogen's aducanumab, he had worked with Biogen on another drug called Spinraza for the treatment of an unusual disease called spinal muscle atrophy that affects children. And the work with Biogen had resulted in the approval of their drug in 2016. 4 months after that approval, Billy Dunn would appear at a meeting of the patient advocacy group Cure SMA. And the president of Cure SMA invited Dunn to the podium of that celebratory meeting and said, you all have done such a critical role. Thank you all for what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. And asks Billy Dunn to come up and take applause for that critical role. So Dunn comes to the podium and he asks, is anyone from Biogen or Ionedes, which are the two companies that had developed Spinraza? Anyone from Biogen or Ionis here, he said. There they are. And he points to them in the audience. Y'all keep your hands up. Dunn's Texan. Y'all keep your hands up so everyone in the room can see y'all. And then he turns to the Cure SMA. You talked about the FDA. I want you to know what tremendous people these folks are too. An unrelenting approach from Ionis and Biogen to support this drug and to work with us at the agency as well as with you at the patient community to get this done as rapidly as possible. So Dunn was united with Biogen and celebrated this work he had done earlier with them to move this drug as rapidly as possible. And here he was again now with an even bigger disease without an effective drug, working once again with Biogen. He was united with Biogen, but FDA was divided over what to do. After the approval on June 7th, what would come out were, in fact, at least 3 positions within FDA about what to do about the problem of aducanumab. One, standard approval, what Dunn advocated for in November at that hearing. Another position that some held was not standard, but accelerated approval. And a third position, such as was taken by the statistician, whose report was essentially skipped, was no approval, neither standard nor accelerated. In March of 2021, it was discovered that an internal committee organized to review controversial drug decisions within FDA met to review the case for the approval of aducanumab, and they would recommend no approval. But still, within a divided FDA, Dunn would persist and issue the decision that I've already told you about. Let me drill down more to the label that was written for the drug on June 7th. It was for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. There was no mention of the need for the test for amyloid, which was a key eligibility criteria to get into the clinical trial. There was no mention in the label of the severity of Alzheimer's disease. No mention of the mild cognitive impairment Maria Carrillo spoke about, or mild stage dementia. Essentially, what it was saying was a patient diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, however it was diagnosed, should get this drug. There was no discussion of any of the contraindications that kept people out of the clinical trial, in particular, risk of bleeding. One of the side effects of the drug is it can cause small bleeds into the brain, called ARIA, which in fact required people to be off of any medications that can cause bleeding. None of that was part of the label. It was the kind of label that you would write for a drug that was an unequivocal, slam dunk success with clear safety, not a label that you would write for a drug that focused on a window of disease severity defined by a biological measure, with admittedly, even amongst the advocates, such as the Alzheimer's Association, controversial data describing its benefits. Well, what happened after that approval? Soon thereafter, on June 7th, 3 members of that advisory committee that were reviewed the application in November would resign in protest for and or discussed over what had happened and their feeling about how their conclusions about how FDA was now using, or if you will, not using their committees. One of them, Aaron Kesselheim, in his letter to Janet Woodcock, the FDA commissioner, described the decision as the worst decision in the history of FDA. 1 week after that decision, in the rapid cycle of news accounts, and I was among many giving comments in the press about the problem with this decision and how it was a mistake. 1 week after that, in an interview in Stat News, Harry Johns, the president of the Alzheimer's Association, tried to stamp it all down. And he said, dwelling on the approval at this point is not productive for those who can benefit from the treatment. The negative voices focusing on criticizing this decision, he said, are not pro-patient. But those negative voices would persist. The U.S. House and Senate committees that oversee FDA and HHS would call for hearings into the decision. Those hearings have yet to happen, but my understanding is they're still scheduled to happen. I don't know if they're scheduled, but they still plan to have them. A few weeks later, that label that I told you about was revised to state that the drug was actually prescribed now for persons with MCI or mild stage dementia. But still, there was no mention of the need for validation of the presence of amyloid and no effort to update the label to address the risk exclusion on the basis of bleeding risk. Janet Woodcock, the FDA commissioner, as word got out about the relationships between Billy Dunn and Biogen, which I told you about, would ask the Office of Inspector General to investigate the relationships between Biogen and FDA officials. That investigation is ongoing. It's estimated to require, Office of Inspector General says it will take about 9 months at least to do. And several health systems have declined to add the drug to their formulary. This is a very significant event. I'll talk about it in a moment. All right, so that's the history. I apologize for the detail, but it is one of the strangest approvals that I can think of. And I'm not an aficionado of FDA approvals, but this one is a strange one to be sure. Let me talk about why this continues to reverberate through the American healthcare system. The first point I want to make from it is that the controversy has exposed enduring controversy. This decision has exposed enduring controversies in developing treatments for brain diseases, particularly brain diseases that cause cognitive problems. Let's go back to that 22% slowing, that 22% solution, that more time that the Alzheimer's Association was campaigning for. Time, chronos time, is a measure, the count to an event. But in this case, more time to what? Until when? In matters of health and disease, when we think about time, more time, what we're thinking about is more life, perhaps. So in other words, delaying the time until you die. That's probably one of the cleanest of endpoints, if you will, pardon my language, in treating a disease, in measuring a treatment for a disease that's fatal. You live longer, and oftentimes, indeed, that's the endpoint of choice for cancer clinical trials. Other common endpoints that one would sort of think about time until would be time until a hip fracture, or reducing the number of hip fractures, or until a stroke or heart attack. My point is, Alzheimer's disease doesn't have those kind of events. There's no hip fracture, stroke, heart attack for this disease. And certainly living longer with it, delaying the time before you die, is deeply morally problematic as an endpoint. Carrillo, in her defense of the approval, in the letter that that the association wrote to the FDA, spoke of active life. What we're talking about is more time with active life, whatever that is, as though the lives of the millions of persons with moderate stage dementia and beyond no longer have an active life. Hard thing to measure when you think about it. What is an active life? Well, what the measure was a measure called the Clinical Dementia Rating, the CDR, sum of boxes. It's a quirky measure that's never used in clinical practice. It's only used in clinical trials. It's a complicated interview that measures a variety of functional and cognitive abilities. And what the study showed was that the 22% solution, if you will, the 22% was a relative difference, not an absolute difference, between the scores of persons CDR sum of boxes who got the drug versus those who got placebo. And so it was a ratio of that measure of cognition and function, never used in clinical practice, no criticism of it at that point, but not one that anyone knows about. And again, it was a relative difference, which gets to a deeper issue. When we look closer at that difference of 22%, for example, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review found that effect size is a magnitude of insufficient benefit to demonstrate any net health benefit. So ICER's conclusion when they reviewed the data in their independent capacity was there is a difference greater than placebo on at least one of the studies, never mind the other, and that's a different problem. But even that difference greater than placebo is of no net health benefit so as to be worth prescribing it to patients. Moreover, about that benefit, we really don't know much about it because the data from those phase 3 studies has actually never been published and remains to this day unpublished. Word got out, was not refuted by Biogen, that the paper was submitted to a journal, JAMA, but after it was sent back with a request for revisions, the authors of the paper pulled it from JAMA and I presume are taking it elsewhere. So we have yet to see these data, even after the drug's been approved and now is available, well, somewhere available for prescription. The only data that have been presented about this drug are from well-curated meetings on panels at international meetings organized by Biogen. International meetings of Alzheimer's on panels organized by Biogen, excuse me. So the control of the information here and the information itself is rather opaque, hard to understand, and indeed potentially very conflicted, or at least only been curated by Biogen. That's one problem. The second is the steady breakdown in processes at FDA. I've talked about the closeness between Biogen and Billy Dunn. Billy Dunn calling out the leadership of Biogen and the other pharmaceutical company at that meeting. An unrelenting approach, he said, from Ionis and Biogen to support this drug and to work with us, unrelenting approach to work with us as rapidly as possible. Well, that rapidly as possible approach led to a sloppy label that had to be revised. It led to the failure within FDA to work together to arrive at a decision, but rather it was an imperious decision. One would think with a drug as significant as this, for a disease as significant as this, that clear disagreement across the agency would be a signal that we have a problem here. But indeed, we would find out from Janet Woodcock that she would say, I was too busy with Operation Warp Speed to be involved in this. She was not aware of this until pretty much after June 7th, when the controversy blew up. This lack of transparency over the long-intended plan to use accelerated approval is absolutely maddening. Myself and others in the field find ourselves bewildered, why this was never discussed. We at least would have enjoyed the opportunity prior to approval to weigh in on whether amyloid would be an adequate surrogate like LDL and other surrogates are. But that was not the case. And people in the field feel almost cheated of the inability to have had that conversation prior to approval. This decision has raised questions about why we even have an FDA. Accelerated approval is not to give a drug a second chance. In clinical practice, even today, doctors like me are not using amyloid levels. We're using amyloid levels to inform a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, that you do, or more importantly, do not have Alzheimer's if you do not have elevated amyloid. We do not use amyloid at this point in our world to inform judgments about how severe a person's cognitive impairment is or what their prognosis is. We don't follow amyloid levels like we would follow LDL or CD4 counts or blood pressure. And let me emphasize CD4 counts. Prior to any effective treatment for HIV/AIDS, CD4 counts were a good way to tell a patient, I think the disease is getting worse because the CD4 count is dropping, the T cell CD4 line. We don't do that with amyloid. Elevated amyloid is elevated amyloid with or without cognitive impairment. The question are other things that are not worth going into now to better decide what the cause of that or the stage of the cognitive impairment is. And so this was pushing a marker that was way premature in a set of studies that were quite controversial into clinical practice quite prematurely. Which leads me to Janet Woodcock's remark after the approval, when asked to comment on the approval. She said there's an even more powerful force than FDA, and it's called the marketplace. And in some sense, what one thinks about is that accelerated approval is transformed from a way to bring voiceless patients into the process. In the case of the origins of accelerated approval, where the HIV epidemic and patients with HIV/AIDS, many of them gay and men who were kept out of the mainstream, that it's gone from that a mechanism to serve that role to being a way to allow a company to get something out as quick as possible. Remember that point Billy Dunn said, as rapidly as possible, with then after the fact gather the data you need to actually validate indeed whether the drug in fact works to improve patient health and well-being. Biogen has 9 years to conduct the validation study, and how they'll do that validation study with the drug available on the market remains an open question. And indeed it is an open question because Biogen has not announced the plans for that study. No design has been proposed and no timeline has been proposed for when that study will start to validate the endpoint, the relationship between lowering amyloid and clinical benefit. Which leads me to my last point. In America, a disease doesn't fully exist until it has a business model. I know that point sounds cynical, but I think it is a fair descriptive point with normative implications. The drug has an estimated $56,000 per year price tag. That's what Biogen will probably be charging for it. That's what they've suggested. Even critics of this decision, critics of the decision that FDA made, who oppose what FDA did, even critics have said ruefully that the drug is, quote, win-win, because it will benefit memory centers. There's a dark irony here. That $56,000 price tag is charged through Medicare Part B because it's an infusion, and with that comes somewhere between 4 and 6% sort of spin-off of funding to the prescribers. So that's, if you will, the margin that you'll get from this drug. Prescribe enough of it, and you can see how the money starts to flow to begin to fund a memory center. And I have been present in room where folks have talked about, if we can pick up the churn on this drug, we can finally begin to pay for the things that you all need to run your memory center. It's a dark irony when you think about it, that the reason why this disease is considered a crisis in America is the tremendous cost it exacts on the American family. I spend about $2,000 a month of my father's money to organize his care where he lives, and I expect that price tag is going to double in a few months, or certainly within a year, to pay for his care. With the copay that this drug will probably have, that copay translates into about the cost that many families spend per month for informal care. And so you have this dark irony that I have a drug of questionable efficacy that is going to cost you as much as you need to spend to take care of your relative with MCI or mild stage dementia. It's a dark irony. Many years ago, there was a drug called Tacrin. It led to another drug that we now know widely. It's advertised as generic now, but it was sold as Aricept, cholinesterase inhibitors. After years of controversy, even those who were proponents of the drugs would admit that they really were not very useful. We still prescribe them because it's good to hand out something, I suppose. There are some patients who do benefit. Now that they're generic, matters of cost have really fallen off the issue as an issue. But all agree that as much as Tacrin was controversial, it gave us our clinical trial infrastructure. Prior to Tacrin, there was no infrastructure to do clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease clinical research. Tacrin was the jump start to get the Alzheimer's disease centers to have a clinical trial infrastructure, and arguably the field benefited from Tacrin. Whether patients did or not is arguable, but certainly the field benefited. It set up our infrastructure. Arguably, Aduhelm is setting up the clinical infrastructure. But again, what a dark, sad story it is that it takes a drug like that it takes a system like that to have to put a drug like that into practice in order to finally invest in memory centers. A few months ago, I was in Denver at the Alzheimer's meetings, sparsely attended, but I thought I'd go. And a colleague who's been in the field longer than I have, and we all would walk up to each other and go like this. And that was all about aducanumab. Anyway, I said to my colleague, well, whatever. And she said, we should never have had that 2025 goal. And I want to close on that. That 2025 goal, while it was never public, Obama never announced it. His moonshot was for cancer, which for the Alzheimer's field was sort of like, but we kept it quiet. But within the field, that 2025 goal haunted us. And America's love of moonshots. Before the end of this decade, we'll land a man on the moon and safely return him. Good idea to safely return him. Before the decade is over, said Kennedy to inspire us, one of the few residual things from his administration. And that love of moonshots really inspires us. And you could argue for engineering problems, setting deadlines like that, okay. But for human problems that involve human diseases that require human labor, namely patients to be in them, there's a lot of problems with moonshots. And I would argue that this decision is an example of the problem of setting these deadline-driven goals to achieve a health goal, like effectively preventing or treating Alzheimer's disease. I have no objection. I am totally on board with effectively treating and preventing Alzheimer's disease. And that I have no argument with. But that 2025 goal, I would argue, starts to create incentives and positions for decisions that I think the aducanumab story is a sad example of what goes wrong. Billy Dunn wanted to be America's Neil Armstrong. As for me, I'm left in the role of whether to be a conscientious objector and to refuse to prescribe aducanumab for my patients because I don't think it should be available, or do I serve my patients? Do I reluctantly, if you will, go into battle with that weapon? I do know, though, that there's one patient who won't receive that drug, and that's my father. Those are my remarks. Thanks for putting up with it. As I say, it's the beginning of a draft of a chapter that I hope to put in the paperback of my book, The Problem of Alzheimer's. Sorry to have subjected you to it. But that's where I'm at right now. There's more to write on this. We have yet to hear from CMS for their decision about whether to cover the drug, and that will be probably the event of events. Get your tickets for that one. So that's another event that still needs to happen. I'd like to use the remaining time here to sort of open up for discussion and questions. I'm physically on campus, but always on email, and I'm happy to chat afterwards as well. So Holly, the floor is open for questions or discussion. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. Really covered a huge amount of material there, history and current events and kind of future implications. So I'm happy to invite anybody who has a question to either post it to the chat or use the raise hand function, and we can take you off of mute. And while we wait for people to, oh, here's a question in the chat. I was going to ask my own, but let me give everybody else an opportunity. A question in the chat from Victoria Miller, who says, do you see what has happened as an anomaly or indicative of systematic problems at FDA?
I'm very worried about problems at FDA. There have been similar decisions, not as monumental, but with similar features in the space of cancer and also for another neurologic indication for Duchenne's, that have had similar themes to them, not at such a grand and epic and tragic scale as this. But I think it's time for a revisiting of what's going on at FDA, how are they using accelerated approval, how has Janet Woodcock instructed them. I think her comment, there's a more powerful force in the FDA, and that's called the marketplace, is a chilling comment to come from the commissioner of FDA.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from Connie Ulrich, who asks, who says, thank you for your excellent presentation. What do you think from a clinician's perspective has been the effect on patients and their families who are desperate for a treatment that will cure their disease and who are vulnerable? She asks, how do you talk to patients and families about this and balance their safety and risk when they might aggressively want the drug?
Great question. I don't think the FDA should have approved the drug. I think it should only be handed out after signing an informed consent form to be in a research study to prove whether this drug in fact works, not after me signing a prescription. Having said that, I'm a reluctant prescriber. I can't be a conscientious objector. Why? As a physician at the Memory Center, taking care of people who have a disease that fundamentally attacks your autonomy early and relentlessly, I have to do what I can to respect my patients' autonomy. And if after they learn about this drug, its risks, its benefits, the controversial decision that questions FDA's credibility, they want to take it, I'll prescribe it, although I have yet to write a prescription for it. I have found it has divided the patient community. Some patients are, I'll take what I can take. If this drug's available, I'll take it. I have yet to find one of those, although I certain there are some out there to attend the Memory Center, I have no doubt, and I can respect that view. But many are angry. Many are angry because they struggle to find a diagnosis. They struggle to get care. And yet this drug seems to have slid right into clinical practice with this high price tag. And they sort of wonder, why is it that we have a system where I can't find an adult day activity program for my spouse, but now I might be able to get him this drug? And so many are angry as well. It's divided the field and it's divided the patient community.
Thanks. The next question is from Susan Ellenberg, who asks, if the advisory committee had been presented with the case for accelerated approval, what do you think they would have done?
I can't speak for them, but given the data that was in the statistician's report, Tristan's report, I think it's pretty likely that they would have voted against accelerated approval. And I do think, to build on that question, Susan, if that question had been put out to the field, like just field, what do you think? Amyloid as a surrogate, aducanumab as the instrument of that surrogate, the drug that they've said, no, not yet. We're not ready. That is not ready to go. We need to do another study there to really show whether that's the case with this drug and that indication. And that I think is the heart of one of the shockers of this decision.
John Merce points to the concern about FDA and regulatory capture and asks if anyone has looked into conflicting links between staffers and the companies involved.
Well, that's the Office of Inspector General's mission, and we'll see what the Office of Inspector General says. Unfortunately, they've said they won't get us that report for at least 9 months. Having said that, I think, there's a YouTube video of Billy Dunn at that SMA. I don't mean to keep on going back to him, but in some sense, this is about character. This is about people making decisions. And his enthusiastic, I think, showing up at a patient advocacy meeting and saying how much I worked with the company and you were relentless and we moved this as fast as possible. I think as someone at FDA, you have to think about what the messaging that you're sending about that. And I think that we'll hear about what the relationship was with Biogen with respect to aducanumab. But I think this phrase regulatory capture needs conversation, because I think there's a real concern about just that has happened. The regulators were captured by the people that they're supposed to regulate.
The next question is from Christopher Catania, who says, do you think the poor clinical performance of aducanumab necessitates a reconsideration of the amyloid hypothesis? And do you think that reconsideration would mean putting the 2025 goal out of reach?
I think the 2025 goal should be edited to remove 2025, amyloid or no amyloid, tau, no tau, whatever. The frustration in the field, and now I'm getting a little sciencey, is the latest studies that have been done. To have Alzheimer's, you have amyloid and you have tau, and you have neurodegeneration. Until recently, the studies have only required evidence of amyloid and not tau. Recent studies have looked at amyloid and tau in combination and tested drugs. The signals there, are quite provocative. And that's why I think many in the field were so angry, because we were getting there. And then this drops in, and this will disrupt the ability to do those studies with a placebo control, testing anti-amyloid agents where you've documented that whether the person has amyloid and has tau, because you can measure both now using tracers and spinal fluid assays. Why Biogen didn't do amyloid and tau is another story. It's a very interesting story. And so I'm not of the view, and now we're getting off of ethics, that the amyloid hypothesis is done. It certainly is on the ropes, but I think it warrants more study, not to exclude other areas of study. And I will say that the federal effort on Alzheimer's is not just an effort on amyloid. They have invested in and are supporting trials and other studies across a variety of mechanisms. It is a really commendable effort that the feds are investing in NIH across the agencies.
I have a question that's just been sent to me directly, and it relates to what you were just talking about, which is what should happen with other amyloid antibodies? Should they also be granted accelerated approval now that we're getting?
Yeah, I forgot to, again, I've been working on this, trying to capture everything. There's a fifth point that I should have brought up here, which is now this precedent is there. And indeed, of course, and I can't fault the companies for being what companies do, which is, well, I've got an anti-amyloid drug. I've got signal of change on amyloid marker and no evidence of clear safety problems, perhaps. So can I get my approval? And Lilly has brought forth their drug. Biogen's brought forth one of their drugs, another one of their drugs. And all things equal, given the aducanumab decision, they have a strong case to get their drugs approved as well. So we not have but one, but now 2, 3 drugs with similar kinds of evidence out there in terms of the relationship between lowering amyloid and clinical benefit. It only gets more, therefore, complicated and problematic for America, namely CMS, as to for what kinds of patients is this reasonable and necessary, and so why should this drug be prescribed? So we're heading in for a very rocky period as a country over the next 12, 24 months. Very rocky period.
Okay, we only have about a minute and a half left. We have 2 questions. I'm going to ask them both. Allison Whalen says, increasingly FDA emphasizes the patient voice. Do you think FDA is giving patients too much voice when initially approving drugs and deciding indications, to the potential detriment of patients? And then Allison Hoffman asks, what do you think CMS will do with regard to the national coverage determination, and how will that change what's happening clinically?
How do we give patients voice in drug approval is, I think, a question that needs to be visited. I mean, it seems like you just sort of call up an advocacy group, say, why don't you bring us some patients to tell us what you think? Well, guess what they're going to bring? I'm not saying that that's prima facie wrong, but there's got to be a more thoughtful way to get a sense of the views of patients, what matters to them, the views of present patients versus future patients. That's a little more thoughtful. Some sort of idea of a jury of my peers, rather than just, can I have a hand-picked group of people who are going to say a preordained story? And so I think we need to revisit that. I'm not saying that the views of patients is overrepresented or underrepresented, but how should it be properly represented in this process? And I think this decision puts that square up. It is interesting, by the way, that Harry Joggs in December of 2019 was ambivalent about approval. Something happened between December 2019 and June 7th, when, of course, they became bullish about approval with the 22% solution. Allison, that hearing is going to be fun, the CMS hearing. I think it's scheduled sometime or planned roughly sometime in February. In the history of, hang on just a minute. In the history of Alzheimer's, CMS had another grand moment when they had a hearing around whether amyloid imaging should be covered. It had been approved by FDA, but CMS had convened a committee to decide for whom was it reasonable and necessary, or appropriate, excuse me, to prescribe amyloid imaging, and they would vote that the evidence to support that it could be done, and so CMS did not and still does not cover amyloid imaging. We'll be very interesting to see what CMS will do on this one. That key question they have to answer is, I think I might have the lingo wrong, is it reasonable and appropriate?
Reasonable and necessary, I think.
Reasonable and necessary, thank you. And I think it's tough to say to an individual patient that this is reasonable and necessary for you, given the inability to know whether you're benefited, because the scrappy relationship between amyloid lowering and clinical benefit. So we'll see what CMS does. It's going to be a wild hearing.
Okay, well, with that, really good speed round of questions. Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. And we will see you all for the next session on November 1st. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming, everyone. I really appreciate putting up with my talk.